everyone, my name is Emily Silva, and this week I will be talking to you guys about topic 18, future landscapes. Also, before we get started, I'd like to thank Aaron Rios for assisting me with this presentation. So the first article we'll be looking at this week is called Beyond Being There by Jim Holland and Scott Stornetta, published in 1992. And this article focuses on communication, more specifically telecommunication and all of the different mediums by which humans communicate. So the authors describe the characteristics of each medium and their unique features. They outline the advantages and disadvantages of using each medium of communication, and they also describe each medium's mechanisms, goals, and when it would be most appropriate to employ each method in communication. The authors then lay out 4 examples of mediums of communication and then provide a hypothesis for each approach. And basically this article establishes that even though we view face-to-face interactions as the ideal medium of communication, many face-to-face interactions might actually benefit from being handled in other ways that aren't imitative of in-person interactions. But we must also keep in mind that at least in the foreseeable future, no interaction will ever compare to the richness of a face-to-face, in-person interaction. And the article concludes with the idea that we need to redefine being there. And I'll explain what that means in upcoming slides. So at the beginning of this article, the authors establish a couple of things. First off, that face-to-face conversation will always prevail. In-person interactions just provide a richness that is currently unmatched by any other means of communication. And we know this, being engaged in conversation over the phone or with FaceTime or Zoom, it just never gives us the feeling of being there, which is a concept that obviously comes up a lot in this article. And the telecommunication industry is trying to tackle this problem, trying to come up with some form of technology that connects two people that are not physically together, and create a sense of being there, trying to match that same richness of interaction that we get by communicating face-to-face. Researchers are trying to figure out what exactly constitutes being there. What factors can we isolate and measure to be able to accurately compare face-to-face interactions with telecommunication? And maybe we can find out what the latter is lacking. So social psychologists did this. They did this by measuring social presence and information richness of face-to-face communication, audio-video, audio-only, and then written correspondence or email. And what they found was that while the addition of the video component did increase social presence, audio-video is far more comparable to just audio than to an actual face-to-face interaction, basically showing us that we are far from replicating the in-person experience with telecommunication. And before we move on to the key points, here are some keywords that came up consistently in the article. The first is medium, which is the method of communication. This could be face-to-face, audio-video, audio-only, etc. The next is complex processes, which is used to describe the actions we take to initiate and maintain working relationships and how it is mostly determined by physical proximity. Mechanisms are used to describe features that accompany each medium of communication. For example, for the face-to-face medium, some mechanisms include eye contact, body posture, stereotypical openings and closings in language, like hello and goodbye, etc. And finally, we have computationally mediated communication, which is just a fancy way of saying communication mediated by technology. So, after the authors established that face-to-face interactions are nothing like telecommunication interactions, they start to question, well, will we ever get to the point where systems can achieve the same level of information richness as face-to-face interactions? And then some studies emerged that showed that systems designed to replicate face-to-face interactions may never be close enough to the real thing. And then researchers start to think, well, it seems like we can't solve this problem so long as people use different mediums of communication for in-person versus physically distant, because the people separated by distance will always be at a disadvantage. Then they concluded that the only way to solve this telecommunication problem is to develop tools that people prefer to use, even when they have the option of interacting in person. So, what would these tools look like? It would obviously need to satisfy the needs of communication so well that people would prefer to use it even when they're in close proximity to each other. So while face-to-face interaction is the model for communication, researchers determined that not all communication mediums should imitate face-to-face interactions. And this is because of mechanisms, because some things that might be effective in face-to-face interaction, such as eye contact and body posture, may not be appropriate or effective in other communication mediums. So then, researchers start thinking, well, what could new mediums accomplish that may not be achievable with face-to-face interaction? And a couple of things include anonymous communication. You can't do that in person, obviously. Asynchronous communication, being able to respond at any time as opposed to having to give immediate in-person feedback. And finally, the ability to archive information, which also cannot be accomplished in person. And then we start to look at, well, what's wrong with the original medium? And not necessarily what's wrong with it, but how can we improve it? What requirements are not satisfied by in-person interactions that might be able to be satisfied with telecommunication? And email is a great example of this. It is a very successful tool, yet it does not imitate face-to-face mechanisms. It encourages asynchronous communication, obviously, being able to respond at your own leisure, and it is used by groups even when they are in close proximity to each other. In an office building, two people could be in neighboring cubicles and could still send emails back and forth to each other. So, with all of this in mind, the authors outline 4 example approaches to telecommunication. And the first example is ephemeral interest groups. These would be online discussion platforms where there'd be short-lived discussions thought of as disposable. This mechanism would allow groups to be created in electronic space where people can engage in informal communications. So this might be like Slack, I was thinking, could kind of be somewhat like this, where you can just kind of create channels that don't necessarily have to last a long time, but could serve a short specific purpose. And the hypothesis for this example was that people using this system that aren't present rate themselves as more of the community than those who don't use it and aren't present, meaning that just by being involved in this online group, you'd feel like you were part of a conversation, you'd feel like you were engaging in communication. Moving on to the second example, meeting others. This would be a platform that would enable you to meet others by giving you access to information about people. Kind of like having an online profile. It would include publications, your picture, any kind of information that you want to include, and then personalized things like cartoons and quotes, etc. And the hypothesis for this example is that it would allow low-cost electronic access that would encourage people to learn about other people and initiate conversation. The third example is anonymity. This would be like an online platform that would allow for anonymous messaging and communication. And while it may not be exactly valuable, it is an example of an approach that does not imitate face-to-face communication. And basically the hypothesis for this example is that anonymous communication would allow people to discuss topics that would otherwise be taboo or personal, or people might just be reluctant to talk about in person. And then the final example is semi-synchronous discussion, which would be like an online discussion board that would encourage users to explore media and mechanisms. It wouldn't be completely synchronous or asynchronous, and unlike other discussion board platforms, the first discussion board post wouldn't set the tone for the rest of the conversation, which can happen easily in a lot of discussion board style platforms. Instead, users would be able to respond to messages at any time, but the responses would appear at fixed times. And the hypothesis for this example is that use of semi-synchronous mechanisms will encourage a greater range of responses than the normal synchronous or asynchronous mechanisms. So to sum it all up, this article addresses the telecommunication problem. How can we improve telecommunication to give us that in-person, rich experience, that feeling of being there? Well, we have to acknowledge that face-to-face synchronous interactions might actually benefit from being handled in a way that is not very imitative of face-to-face encounters. And we must create tools that people will prefer to use in all conditions, no matter where they are or how close they are to the person that they're communicating with. These future tools need to be need-based and mechanism-based. We need to be able to identify the needs that are not met by face-to-face interactions, that are not met by being in physical proximity to each other. And we need to leverage the strengths of new mediums and acknowledge that we can gain something different from mediums other than face-to-face interaction. With all this in mind, bottom line is that some things should be communicated face-to-face. And as we develop this technology, we will constantly be redefining what being there actually means. The second article that I will be talking about is Human-Robot Interaction, Status and Challenges by Thomas Sheridan, published in 2016. This article focuses on human-robot interaction, or HRI, and the objectives of this article are to review the current status of human-robot interaction and describe the current research challenges for the human factors community. The authors outline 4 HRI application areas and describe each area and its challenges. Some key points made in this article are that HRI is a rapidly evolving field, applicable to all types of robots and AI, and there's been much success with robots under teleoperation. HRI is only growing with relevancy, and more research is needed in this field to be able to develop more advanced technology with human factors integrated design. So before we move on to the key points, here are some keywords that came up consistently in the article. The first is human-robot interaction, or HRI. It is the extensive and diverse research and design activity and is involved in technical disciplines like engineering, computer science, and artificial intelligence. The next word is teleoperator. These are machines that perform manipulation and mobility tasks in the remote physical environment in correspondence to continuous control movements by a human. So it's obviously very much in consistent correspondence with a human operator. The next is telerobot, which are machines that perform routine tasks automatically based on a coded computer problem. These robots are capable of sensing their environments and are also capable of communicating information back to a human operator who is constantly updating its computer instructions. So the beginning of this article basically focuses on the idea that robots have evolved. In the past, the relationship between robots and humans has been one that's kind of been a master-slave dynamic as opposed to a teammate relationship that we're kind of seeing now, and that we're hoping to advance more towards in the future. And that brings me to HRI is the future. It's a rapidly growing field. There are hundreds of publications each year and activity by many different professional societies. And it's so relevant because it's applicable to all robots and artificial intelligence. And in this article, the authors outline 4 main areas of application where we see humans and robots interacting. So the first is human supervisory control. Now this is any instance where humans have to supervise a robot. This could be on an assembly line. This could be robots that access and deliver packages, mail, medicines, any kind of automated task, and this also includes telerobots. The second area of application is remote control. This is obviously any technology that is being controlled by humans. It could be space, terrestrial undersea vehicles. They could be engaging in non-routine tasks in hazardous or inaccessible environments. And teleoperators also fall under this category. The next area of application involves all automated vehicles, basically any vehicle that is automated and that has a human passenger. And the last area of application is human-robot social interaction. This is any instance where robots are directly interacting with humans for the purpose of entertainment, teaching, comfort, any kind of assistance, or taking care of someone. In this paper, the authors outline a few challenges, mostly having to do with task analysis, teaching the robot and teaching them how to avoid unintended consequences, acknowledging that humans and robots have mutual models of each other and that we need to take into account these models in AI design. The use of robots in education is also a challenge for researchers, and just in general, coping with user culture, fears, and other value considerations. In this article, researchers also emphasized that robots will be controlled by humans for the foreseeable future. So as teleoperators, we need to be aware of the dynamic of how we interact with robots and what human factors need to be taken into consideration. Another point that was emphasized heavily in this article is that there is a great need for human factors in this rapidly expanding field of human-robot interaction. The human race is changing very slowly, while computers and robots are evolving at a very rapid pace. And because it is so rapid, it's hard to come to conclusions about HRI because they're likely to become invalid in a very short time. The HRI community is more focused on building and demonstrating what works and provoking new ideas than in providing detailed and validated scientific conclusions. So to summarize, HRI is the future. It's applied in almost all robot and artificial intelligence tasks in almost all industries, manufacturing, space, aviation, military operations, education, just to name a few. And as technology advances, as we come up with more complex designs and the stakes get higher, so will the relevancy of this field. With that being said, research in HRI is lacking. It demands participation by the human factors community because technology is only advancing and we need to be able to keep up with it. Some challenges in HRI research has to do with lifestyle, fears, and basic human values. Authors posed the question, if a job is better done by a robot, should it always be done by a robot? And should robots ever be able to use their own judgment? Can human factors methods help answer such questions? And with that, I will leave you with the discussion questions. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the semester.